My name is Tom Chidwick. I'm the manager of the Institute, and I'm delighted to welcome you to Queen Mary University of London for this important conversation about how we can rectify the historic underrepresentation of women in Parliament, local government and British public life more generally. While only Boris Johnson has had more unfavourable press coverage recently than my beloved university, Queen Mary has a long and, I think, inspiring tradition of enabling women. It was created out of 4 institutions, including Westfield College, the first women's college in the University of London, which, as Caris Wilson, the seminal economic historian, said, grew out like a child in the desert in the higher education system of the 1880s. When preparing for this evening, I've been reflecting on the work of Mary Stocks, the economist and wartime principal of Westfield. Stocks was a fixture on Radio 4, regularly appearing on Any Questions, and famously interviewed Nancy Astor in 1956. And in her memoirs, My Commonplace Book, Stocks recalls carrying a banner alongside Keir Hardie in the famous Mud March in February 1907, when 3,000 women marched from Hyde Park Corner down to the Strand in support of women's suffrage. Stocks, always identified as a suffragist rather than a suffragette, recalls that as we moved off through the arch of Hyde Park Corner, we met a barrage of ridicule from hostile male onlookers. Go home and do the washing, and go home and mind the baby were the most frequent taunts flung at us. And as a 16-year-old schoolgirl, Stocks was powerfully affected by the vitriol levelled at women peacefully protesting for their right to vote. And she noted that she was uncertain how her participation in the Mud March would be regarded by those in authority at St Paul's Girls' School. She later told a BBC interviewer that I need not have worried, for all the schoolmistresses were suffragists. Stocks was never one for timeless, pithy one-liners, but I think her story reminds us of the deterrent impact that gender-based violence and abuse continues to have on women in public life. Given our late start, I must pass over to our distinguished chair, Dr. Javier Seguria, soon. So I'll fast forward a century to our stellar panel this evening. We're one member down. Frances Scott is on her way. I'll probably rush out of a side door in a minute to go and find her. But we're delighted to be joined by Emma Best, who is a citywide member of the London Assembly and a Conservative councillor in Waltham Forest, isn't it?
Yeah.
Good. Emma worked with vulnerable children and young people across the capital before she was elected to the Assembly. Next to her is Kiran Mahil, who is the Secretary of the Labour Women's Network and Assistant Head Teacher just down the road in Bow. She was previously the National Women's Officer for the Labour Party. And then finally, Rainbow Murray is Professor of Politics here at Queen Mary and is an expert on representation, gender and diversity. Having been at Queen Mary since 2007, I'm told Rainbow was also our first senior diversity lead. And I'm sure your medal is in the post, Rainbow. Before I conclude, I should say a note of thanks both to, I don't think she's still here, but my friend Dr. Sophia Collignon for putting this session together, and for our student ambassadors who you met out the front for all their help this evening. We're especially pleased that we're joined by our newest research fellow, Mary Honeyball, who'll be bringing this evening's discussion to a close by reflecting on her experience in local government and the European Parliament. Mary, you're very welcome, as indeed are all of you. Thank you.
There you go.
Hi, I'm Frances Scott, founder of 50/50.
Come in, Frances. Welcome.
That's a great entrance.
Yeah,
I apologise, people.
Don't worry.
Thank you for being here. I'm sorry it's taken me so long.
So, given that we have a full panel today, as Tom was saying, we're very happy and pleased to welcome this event. I was actually quite happy when Sophia asked me to chair it, not only because it's very close to my heart in terms of topic, it's also because I love the Manor Institute event, so it's kind of a nice thing to be back in this process. Then, as Thomas said, we are joined by 4 amazing women who have all different expertise and work in these issues. Just to provide a bit more kind of contemporary context, currently there are 225 women MPs in Parliament, And there's a question of whether we can get more, hopefully 100 more, if Francis, correct me if I'm wrong.
Exactly.
But also, we are in the middle of a crucial moment because parties are currently selecting candidates.
Indeed.
They are in the process of selecting the cohort for the new election, whenever that is, hopefully soon. And therefore, and I would say that even the Conservative Party is facing a lot of candidates kind of coming in and MPs who are saying that they're not going to run. So openings are there, and all parties have the opportunity to field more candidates. So because we're in a crucial moment, I think this conversation is particularly important, and I hope we can come out of this room with some knowledge, exchange ideas of how to make it happen. The format of this talk will be that each one of our guests here will have 7 to 10 minutes. We'll start with Francis, Emma, Kiran and Rainbow. And then we're going to open up for Q&A. I have a couple of questions here in case you feel shy, don't want to talk, but hopefully that's not the case. And then we're going to have Mary for our final remarks. And obviously there's going to be wine and some nibbles afterwards, which I hope you can all enjoy. So with that said, I leave the room to Francis. We already mentioned your background and everything. So.
Okay. Well, I apologise that I wasn't here to hear the introduction. I had the wrong venue down, so I'm afraid I've been wandering around Queen Mary University. Got to know your campus quite well. And lots of people on it asking directions. Anyway, it's really great to be here with you. If I'm repeating what you've said already, please just nudge me, right? So I founded 50/50 Parliament in a fit of anger, really, about 100, no, it feels like 100 years ago, 10 years ago. And it was mainly because about 5 years before that, my daughter, age 9, had come bounding out of primary school. And she was super excited. She said, "Mum, I've just been elected to school council." I said, "Hey, that's fantastic. You're representing the whole class." She said, "No, of course not. There's always one boy and one girl on school council because our experiences are different." I mean, that to me was a light bulb moment, ka-ching, ka-ching. She then went on to elaborate. The boys don't understand the dilemmas of whether girls should wear skirts or trousers to school, and we don't understand why the boys' toilets get so dirty. Right. Well, that, at that point, that really spoke to me. Their experiences were different, and that's why they needed, gender equality of representation, equal seats and equal say. They get it at primary school. Let me explain a little bit about my background. I mean, I had been a business executive. I was used to wearing big shoulder pads and sort of going around and actually talking to boardrooms, mainly of men, advising them on business strategy and how to sort of turn stuff to the profit, bottom line and stuff like this. I got married, had kids, and changed direction completely. I became an antenatal teacher. I was about empowering women to give birth and helping parents prepare for early parenthood. And the thing that began to frustrate me enormously was that maternity services weren't really designed around the needs of women. And I was sitting on Queen Mary's Hospital board, trying to sort of right this situation. And I was just getting more and more frustrated that policymakers didn't seem to understand the needs of parents and that the unpaid caring work that women do, and this is fundamental to society. It also annoyed me that it was women that were deemed, that were the people that seemed to do this unpaid, the people that did this unpaid work, whereas actually many of the men that came to my classes would have been interested in playing their part in parenting if society and policymakers and the structures were such that it was possible for them to participate equally in family life, the pleasures and the pains of being a parent, but this was all kind of seemed to be falling to women. Anyway, so then my daughter saying, equal seats, equal say on her school council, I thought, well, why isn't democracy designed like that? And I began talking about it, and then after a few years, my eldest daughter, who was on the point of going to university, said, "Mum, stop talking about it, do something." And at that point, I don't know if you've heard about the No More Page 3 campaign, but this was run by an inspirational young woman called Lucy Ann Holmes, who had set up a petition on change.org to try and prevent Page 3 happening. And Page 3 was Page 3 of The Sun, where there was always a topless woman. And I, as a woman, had kind of learned to live with this. But I really admired this young woman taking on this misogyny and sexism within the newspaper industry. And at the same time, Laura Bates had written a book called Everyday Sexism, which was a very powerful thing. So I kind of thought, well, why can't a woman like me, I'm a fairly privileged middle-class woman, start saying what I think we need, which is gender equality of representation. And a young man came back to one of my antenatal classes with his baby, a daughter, and he asked me, he said, "Frances, how are you?" I said, "My head is pounding with politics. I really think we should have gender equality of representation." He said, "That's an interesting idea." I said, "Are you interested in politics?" He said, "Yeah, I did PPE at Oxford, but I never thought about gender equality of representation." And I mean, this just said it all. The institution, the sort of the establishment, the people that feed into the establishment, this kind of thing has not even occurred to them. And so he was good enough then to send me an email the following day saying, I had no idea it was so bad. At that point, only 23% of our MPs were women. Women were outnumbered 3-1 in the Commons. And of course, it's much worse in the Lords. The name says it all. And then he said, "Oh, there are 65 countries that do better than us. I mean, we think that we're a leading democracy." And yet, women, who are actually the majority of the population, are so completely underrepresented. He then sent me another email saying, "By the way, the domain name 5050 Parliament's available." Well, I was used to setting up websites. I've been running a sort of an online business for a while. So I set up the 5050 Parliament campaign. It's gone from strength to strength. We now run something called the Ask Her to Stand campaign and Sign Up to Stand. We have over 3,000 women who've signed up to stand with us. At the last general election in 2019, 50 of the women standing were part of 5050. 9 actually went on to win seats in the Commons. 6 of the 12 extra women elected were part of 5050, which is fantastic. But our ambition is to get 50 more women elected at the next election, and then 50 more at the next election, because you should rightly say we need 100 more women elected. And hopefully so in a decade of democracy, in the next 10 years, we'll get gender balance of representation. Why does it matter? It matters for the 4 R's: representation, resources, responsibility and respect. Representation shapes policy. In Scandinavia, where they have gender equality of representation, men get parenting leave. They get paid parenting leave. The result is they take it. This means that men play their part in family life. It enhances relationships. With gender equality of representation, it was women that fought for women to have equal pay. Why is the tax on tampons? President Obama was asked. Well, because it was men that were making the laws when those taxes were passed. They were deemed a luxury product. So, representation, we need women's voices for women, things that women care about to be, policy matters. Resources. Women are 50% of the population. They're 60% of law graduates. We need our parliament to draw upon the widest possible pool of talent, including the talent and experience that women represent. It's about responsibility. It's a woman's... Oh my God, forgive me. It's a woman's world too, right? And women should play their part in solving the problems that future generations face. And last but not least, it's about respect. Parliament, our democratic institutions, should be leading the way in showing respect for women. We should have at least, one of the things we should have is 50-50 shortlists. When it comes to women candidates going forward to these selection committees, women should be given the opportunity to stand on the political stage. The selection committees should be given the opportunity to see what women candidates look like, how they present themselves, and hopefully then more women will be selected. If more women are selected, then more women will be elected. So I'm calling upon you, all of you, don't just sit here, do something, take action. Obviously, go to our website. You can join free of charge. If any of you have deeper pockets, become a friend of 50/50. If you know a woman who would make a great elected representative, ask her to sign up to stand with us, because we're a kind of friendly network with a New Girls Network, the antidote to the Old Boys Network, with a New Girls Network here to support women to progress in politics. Thanks for listening, and I'll hand over now and look forward to hearing your questions.
Thank you very much. Very good timekeeping as well. So, after that, I leave the floor to Emma. So, I'll let you know when you have 2 minutes, okay?
Okay, I don't think I'll need it, to be honest. I can't find it. I don't think I'm quite getting to the flow like Francis, but I will say that in City Hall we still have the same issues. We're still trying to work out how the boys make the toilet so smelly, but apart from that, so I worked with Francis as part of 50/50 as a diversity ambassador, so I'd like to talk in a little bit about the intersectionality I think that comes into trying to get more women to stand. But what I wanted to first talk about was something that we find through Women to Win, which is the Conservative Women's Network. And there's been a lot of reflection and analysis on this. So basically, if you want to stand to be a Conservative MP, the first step you take is you request a form from the party to indicate that you'd like to stand and give some details about yourself and why you think you'd be a great MP. Yeah, so hopefully you can still hear me. Is that better? Great, because this is just my voice now, so there's not much I can do anyway. But what we found actually is with the forms when they're sent out is when these are sent to men, the party receive them back within 24 hours to 48 hours of them being sent out. Whereas when they're sent to women, women will sit on them for 6 to 12 months. And as they've delved further into this and asked people why it is, it's because the more they speak with women, it's because women question themselves and they're saying, am I perfect for this role? Can I definitely do it? Am I good enough? They look at the questions and they think, do I stand up to that mark? Am I good enough to be a member of parliament in our nation's great democracy? Whereas, put bluntly, the blokes are just like, yeah, I can do that, and shove it in and see what happens. And so actually, it's addressing that issue, and so that's why the campaign. And if you hadn't heard of it before this evening, the Ask Her to Stand. Some people have said to me, well, why do we just tell anyone to stand? I mean, it's silly. You have to have something. You can't just ask everyone to stand. And I say, yes, you do need to ask everyone to stand. Tell women to start making that leap, believe in themselves, and just put your name forward. And I say to people often when they're going for seats or when they're first starting on the track of trying to get into politics, be it local politics, regional politics or national politics, is just take that first step, because if you get a knockback, it is all part of the journey and you have to be in it to win it. And so women, we need to get more that political confidence that we are good enough, and when you see something, you know you can be it. So actually it's helping that representation is going up, but it's just not good enough. So that's our first problem. And then within Women to Win, that's one of the kind of things that we're always trying to tackle. And I know it's similar with 50/50 as well. And that's why that campaign around Ask Her to Stand is so good, to just tell women, just do it. Just do it. You don't think about, am I good enough? Just do it. You know, you can take the criticism or positive criticism, feedback, and work on your political career. But get on that track. Don't try and be perfect and then get on the political track. Get on there and learn as you go, because that's what, to be quite frank, the men are doing. So that's what women should be doing as well. And most of the time, if you're thinking about standing, then it's probably because you've got something about you that makes you good enough to do it. So believe in that first thought that made you think, yeah, I can do that. But that's where I want to come as well to the intersectionality of it, because it's not always that easy to see. You know, we're all within the Women to Win or 50/50, we're all women, but we have differences about us, and it's difficult to see that. So for example, I'm a gay woman, but you know, lots of people have different intersectionality you can't see, and it's really important as well to reach out to those people who feel like maybe I'm seeing women get into parliament, but I'm not seeing women like me. And that's a separate hurdle that we're trying to as well fight in 50/50 and within Women to Win, to say that Parliament is open to all women. And the more and more you fight that, you find women that, you know, who could add so much to Parliament, but perhaps they're fighting so many other things in their lives that it's very difficult to even think, how do I begin on this journey? And so that's why it's really important to start putting things in place like how we can bring in certain funds to help women stand, how we can bring in things like childcare sessions when we do canvassing. So a lot of constituencies have started having childcare days where one person will stay with kids, and it gives the women a lot of women the opportunity to go out. And so it's kind of looking about how do we break down those barriers beyond just saying stand, because a lot of people have additional barriers. So it's trying to figure out not just making Parliament representative in terms of 50-50 and having more women stand, but how do we make sure that we have women from across our country's population represented? Because to come back to the points that Francis was making around that representation, it doesn't stop with just having women as a blanket. We need all sorts of different women from all kinds of backgrounds who bring different things to Parliament in order to represent what women from all walks of life are going through in the UK. And so I would end with just that on the important points, I think, of considering the intersectionality across these campaigns, but also to make clear why Ask Her to Stand is so good, because it's just telling women, just take the dive, do it, and believe in yourselves. And we've seen from applications that is so needed, to just tell people, just do it. Thank you.
I'm not going to use this very personal voices. So, Kiran, for yours, guess that if you want to use a microphone or not, up to you.
I think we'd be told not to, so I'll follow that instruction and just say, I was nodding very much as I was hearing Francis and Emma just speak, and actually in a political panel you don't always find much consensus, but it's quite nice to be on a panel like this where basically we are all here this evening because we want to know how to get 100 more women onto those green benches by 2030. So in 7 short years, how are we going to increase the number of female parliamentarians? And that's the question I think we all should hold in our heads as we're listening to some of the advice and some of the strategies I'm going to speak to that what Labour women have been doing. I'm assuming that everybody in the room is wanting us to meet that objective. We're here because we believe that Parliament should have 100 more women by 2030, and because we want to make gender equality a reality when it comes to parliamentary representation. Now, I want to see that happen because, yes, I believe in gender equality, but I fundamentally believe that our democracy, our economy, our public services, the transport system, public discourse, international relations, basically everything would be improved if there were more women in the chamber and more women in the room when decisions are being made. And we've heard this, to make sure that the people with the expertise and the experiences of life are making those decisions that affect us all. And with great respect to our Sisters and Women to Win and the Conservative Party, our goal, Labour Women's Network's goal, is for general election 2024, which we imagine it to be, is to replace Tory men with a bunch of diverse women. That's what we are here to do. So as you heard, my name's Kiran Mahil. I'm here representing Labour Women's Network, and I'm also a secondary school leader just down the road. So at lunchtime today, I asked some Year 7s whilst out on the playground what they think is needed to get more women into Parliament by the time they leave school, because that's the time frame we're talking about, those 7 years, they'll be 18 at that point. And I won't go into everything that they said, but some of their remarks resonate with some of the things that I want to discuss later in my talk. So they said, number one, stop the shouting. It seems like a very noisy and unkind place. Make politics more about helping people, because people need a lot of help right now. And teach us in school what it's about. I don't really know if I can be a member of Parliament. I don't know what qualifications you need to get the job. So quite a lot of insight from a bunch of 11-year-olds I found. So back to my other job. So as Labour Women's Network National Secretary, just to give you a bit about who we are. So we were founded 35 years ago to secure women's equality in the Labour Party. We're the only official women's affiliate to the Labour Party. So our bread and butter, the basics of what we do is we train and we empower women to be change agents, to be leaders, to stand for office, wherever that may be. Yes, parliamentary representation is important, but women can make a difference at all levels within our democracy, as Emma shows. So it isn't, we're having that conversation about Parliament, but it is important for us to remember there are many layers to our democracy, and women should be, in my view, in all of those layers. So that's a bit about who we are. So now on to kind of what we do. So we exist to secure women's equality in the Labour Party, and we felt that we have made progress over the years in doing that. When it comes to overcoming some of the barriers for women's representation, the Labour Women's Network have sought to do it in two main ways. So through structural solutions and through culture change. So I'll speak to those 2 points and give you some kind of practical examples of what the Labour Party has been doing to increase women's representation. So the mechanism that's proven to work globally and here in the UK Parliament has been quotas for women's representation. And Labour's actually gone one step further than what Francis has called for in 50-50 shortlists, in the fact that we had all women shortlists. When Labour was in power, they passed the legislation to allow for that to happen. And that has transformed the Parliamentary Labour Party. So the Parliamentary Labour Party is now composed of 52% of the Parliamentary Labour Party are women, and that's compared to just 34% of MPs in the House. And it is without a doubt all women shortlists that's allowed that to happen. Now, all women shortlists can't be used. I'm not sure if people are aware of that. Labour can't use all women shortlists in this round of parliamentary selections. We've kind of been victims of our own success. There was a proportionality clause in that legislation that says once you reach 50%, you are no longer allowed to use that mechanism. But we haven't rested on our laurels, because with all equalities issues, we know that if you don't keep marching forward, it's not as though you stand still, you actually go backwards. So what we have sought to do instead is look at another structural issue, which is selections. So the cost and the time period of parliamentary selections. Isabel Hardman, who's a journalist, not to be confused with the other Isabel journalist, Oakeshott. Isabel Hardman wrote a book, Why We Get the Wrong Politicians. It's quite an interesting read, very accessible read that I would recommend. And she points to the fact the undemocratic nature and the expense of parliamentary selections do act as a barrier when trying to diversify who stands for parliamentary office. And she reported actually in the book that there was a website conducted by, a survey conducted by Conservative Home, which asked 37 Conservative Party candidates how much running for election had set them back, and the average was £34,392.
Just to say, I updated that in a paper in Today's Money, but that was before inflation went bonkers and it had gone up to 60,000. So,
oh wow, okay.
Given the current cost of living, it's probably 70 grand now.
Okay, that's.
Sorry to interrupt.
No, not at all. I mean, I was going to say that's a welcome interruption, but it's kind of not a welcome interruption, really, is it? But making the point that these things can be prohibitively expensive for the majority of people who believe that they could be good parliamentarians. So the Labour Women's Network fought and won a campaign within the Labour Party so that there's a spending cap on Labour selections, and there's a shorter timetable. So it used to be a 12-week process, it's now a 6-week process with a spending cap to help to try and address that problem of parliamentary selections. So another structural problem is, and it's sometimes referred to as kind of the pipeline problem, and I think Emma, you were speaking to this in terms of women coming forward. Well, actually we don't really find that in the Labour Party. We don't really have much time for the argument that there's not enough women coming through. They're there, they're ready to stand. It's not about necessarily fixing the women, it's the system itself which is preventing these women from going on. So one way that we kind of know that and we help to overcome it is through our training programme. So Labour Women's Network has trained upwards of 400 women this year alone in a variety of ways, so in person, residential, online, because we also meet the needs of where women are. We know that women have incredibly busy lives, so we try to make sure that training can be on the terms and accessible for a great number of women. And that parliamentary training, we have seen some early successes already. So we had Juliet Campbell, who selected for Broxton over the weekend, Miata Fambule, who selected for Camberwell and Peckham, all Labour Women Network training graduates. So that is helping, not to kind of fix a pipeline problem, but to help those women just get through. And that's one of our kind of proudest things, I think, the Labour Women's Network is of the training that we offer. So just briefly on culture change. Sometimes culture change is harder to measure, but it's as important in my view, if not more important actually, because it speaks to the kind of the very meaning of like what a politician is and what's politics for. And we understand the significance of changing the culture of politics. And we've had some successes when it comes to cultural change within the Labour Party, which we hope will influence politics at large. So 2 things really. The first being the usualisation of women in politics. So we have successfully made sure that we've outlawed all male panels at any Labour Party event. That does not happen. We also actively write women's contributions back into history. So a lot of our members have got books out who recognise Labour women who often have been written out of the record, not just of kind of national memory, but also within the Labour movement's memory. And that's important to have this utilisation of women. We've always been here. We've always been political. It's just perhaps it hasn't been as visible, and we seek to address that. We've also taken deliberative action to make politics a safe and welcoming space for everyone. So we have got, then, by no means satisfied, but we've improved the procedures on reporting and acting on sexual harassment within the Labour Party. We campaign and continue to diffuse abuse against women in political life, and we support and send solidarity to sisters when they face it, because unfortunately it is a reality for women in public life. And I think another thing that is important to note, and this does bring cultural change, is that actually we've created what we call a sisterhood of all shades of red. So diversity is important, of course, diversity on points that Emma talked to in terms of intersectionality, but diversity of thought as well. And it's really important that a political party or politics in general have space for a variety of political views. So those are some of the practical steps that we've taken within the Labour movement. But there's a lot more to consider to make that dream of 100 women a reality by 2030. Now, I don't pretend to have all, if not any of the answers, but I just want people to consider a couple of things before I close. So the areas that I'm left thinking that I think would be helpful for our discussion is, one, the idea of the rise of the local MP. So Professor Phil Cowley of Queen Mary, writing in this month's Political Insight, details the rise of proportion of MPs who were born in the region that they now represent in the Commons. Now, on the face of it, that sounds positive in our system of constituency representation. But just ask yourself the question, who are we missing out if we give a high priority to the place of birth? So can a really talented woman who believes in Labour values, is active in her community, has the brilliant ideas of how to improve the country, can she ever make it to the green benches if she was born and lives in the home counties? Now, do we think that is fair or not? So how far is that trend of increased localisation helping or hindering women enter Parliament? Or if she's born abroad. The job of a modern MP. So a lot of what MPs do isn't actually scrutinising legislation. A huge amount of time is taken up with constituency work, with casework. The party whip system means that you're not really encouraged to have freedom of thought or to look or to scrutinise legislation. Now, does that impact who stands for office? And something that we've touched upon, which is our toxic political culture. It is toxic for a lot of people who put themselves forward into public life. So I suppose, how can we all play a greater role in kind of civilising political discourse
So the nature of how our politics is done radically changes. Now I hope I can go back to my year 7s tomorrow with some reassurances that by the time they leave school, Parliament will be a noble place for diverse women to be. And I'm looking forward to hearing everybody's ideas about how we can do that. Thank you.
So, Rainbow, it's your turn now.
Thank you. I'm very glad that I got to go last, because my fellow 3 speakers said some of the things that I would have said, but better. So I will try to complement rather than simply reinforce what they've said, but it's wonderful to be on this panel. So we started off thinking about the concept of ask her to stand. And this is what I might call the who dares argument. And we socialise boys from a young age to be more confident and assertive as a culture, and we socialise girls to be more communal and sacrificing. So whilst I agree with you in that this is not in many cases the main problem, that women do come forwards, it's not that women don't come forwards, there is also a role where it is useful to encourage women to stand, because often men receive encouragement from others when they don't necessarily need it, and women don't receive that encouragement when maybe they do. So if you know a woman that you think would be a great MP, tell her. Because it could be that she actually secretly thought it herself and she just needed that external validation to give her that final push to go do it. But more important, I think, even than who dares, is who cares. Mm-hmm. And I don't mean, why are we here? I mean, who's looking after other people? Mm-hmm. Because she who cares doesn't win. And that is one of the main problems that we see in politics, that it is very, very difficult to combine politics with parenthood. Part of that is structural. For example, unless you are fortunate enough to represent a London constituency, your working life, unlike most other jobs, your working life is by definition divided between 2 locations. And that makes childcare very complicated. And that means that you can't fix the problem by changing the working hours of Parliament. Because if you have everyone go home at 5 o'clock, you're extending the working week, which means it's longer before people in other parts of the country can get home to their constituencies. So that's difficult. But more than that, it's culturally ingrained within politics that politics is not very accepting of parenthood and of caring responsibilities and of caring for elders. And one example of that is that Parliament as an institution is not set up to cope with people who are parents. Mm-hmm. We don't have maternity leave for women who are MPs. So we finally, thanks to COVID, and it took a pandemic, got proxy voting rights, which is really, really useful. But Stella Creasy was highlighting, for example, how she can't get someone else to come and be an MP in her absence. Either she carries on working during maternity leave or her constituency goes unrepresented. And by extension, we don't have paternity leave either. Mm-hmm. And one of the ways in which we need to get rid of the sort of stigma of being a woman in politics is we need to normalise the idea that men are parents too. Mm-hmm. And they also need these leaves. They also need these rights. Mm-hmm. But beyond that, there are some things that are specific to women that we need to be better at accommodating. We need, for example, Tulip Sadiq was denied a comfort break from, she wasn't allowed to leave the session when she was 7 months pregnant by the female speaker at the time. She was deputy speaker, but Eleanor Lang, on the grounds, that's not how the institution works. I think, well, then the institution needs to change. If you're 7 months pregnant, you need to have a snack and you need to go to the toilet, and it shouldn't be against the rules of Parliament for you to do those things. You're not allowed to breastfeed in Parliament. You're not allowed to introduce an alien, your baby, into the chamber with you. But that means that if you can't have maternity leave and you can't take your baby with you, then either you can't be in Parliament or you can't breastfeed your child. And we shouldn't be having to make those choices. We should be finding ways to accommodate them. And even before you get into Parliament, a lot of women in the selection processes found that, if they didn't have children, then people wondering, is she going to sort of run off and have a baby during the election? Or if they just have it, it's like, who's looking after the children? And so there's this sort of cultural bias against women. And some women that I've interviewed have actually said, that was a deterrent because they could not figure out how to combine the desire to be a politician with their desire to have a child. And it's in the interest of our country that we have people in Parliament who understand what it is to be a parent. Mm-hmm. So it's not just in the interest of those individuals to allow them to do that, it's in our interest as a nation to make sure that people who are parents can also be present in Parliament. This also leads on to the idea of how much it costs to get into Parliament. And I think, Kiran made the point beautifully, so I don't want to repeat it. But one thing that I will talk about specifically in relation to how much it costs, people think, why does it cost so much money? What on earth are people spending all that money on? Well, a big chunk of that money is not actually money spent, it's money not earned. Because people are being selected sometimes years before an election campaign and then being expected to commit themselves part-time, if not full-time, to the constituency for years before they even contest a general election. And so it's an opportunity cost, it's lost earnings. But it's also, I completely take on board the fact that you shouldn't be necessarily only allowed to stand in the constituency that you were born in. But it's expensive to go outside the constituency that you live in because you need to be able to travel there, you need to be able sometimes to move there, your childcare network might be in the place that you live. So we also need to think about how to reconcile that to make it easier for people who can't necessarily stand in their home constituency to combine that. But there's a cultural bias against paying politicians who haven't yet been elected to help them run for office. We think, they shouldn't be on the public payroll. But how else do you do it, especially if you're not going to win the election at the end of the day and you can't rely on that MP salary as the end game? A lot of people end up in massive amounts of debt. And given that women often start off with higher costs and lower income, that is a gendered barrier. And it's one that we need to be aware of. And one way to help with that is to reduce the time between selection and election. Some of the people that I spoke to, they only ran because it was a snap election. And they thought, well, this is all going to be over in 5 weeks. I can just use up my annual leave. I can give up 5 weeks of my life. I can call in all my favours to get other people to help with the kids for 5 weeks and I'm done. But if you're doing it for 4 years, it's impossible. And I know people who had a baby during that cycle and got told off by their parties, even though it was 2 years before a general election. You're already supposed to be in campaigning mode. They said, how on earth am I ever supposed to do this? And they left and they walked away. Last but not least, we need to stop violence against politicians, and in particular, we need to stop violence against women in politics. I'm not going to say a great deal more about this because I'm hoping in the discussion that someone in the room who has more expertise on this than me, which is Sophia, who could maybe, if you'd be willing to join in, I think it's a really important point because Sophia's written excellent papers about how this does deter women from running for office and it gets rid of some of our talented politicians. And that shouldn't be something that women have to endure as a cost of doing politics. So I'm hoping we can bring you into the discussion to say a bit more about that. As you're here, why not make the most of it? And I'll stop there. Thank you.
So I guess that the best possible way is to open up the discussion. So if you have any questions, I'm not going to give away this, right?
We haven't got a spare one, but given Gary's problems with the microphones, I think it's easier if we don't use them.
Okay.
But if you really want to do a Frank Sinatra impression, I can bring this over.
So please raise your hand and let us know.
I mean, okay, without mine.
What?
So, thank you very much. So it's me, right?
Yeah. I think because you're talking this way.
I think that microphone is better than this one.
Okay. Well,
So let's try it.
let's try this one then. It's ready. It's ready. There you go.
So thank you very much for this very, very interesting and thought-provoking conversation. I wonder whether you have, so in some of the interviews that I have done and some of the research that I have done, some of the key issues that emerge is the issue of harassment, abuse, and intimidation. I mean, we tend to think about it as from members of the public to the politicians, but some issue that comes across very often is harassment, abuse, and intimidation within the same party. So from other members of the party to prevent women from standing from office. And that particularly is particularly strong during the selection process because women are less visible. It's a different kind of competition. So, Kiran, you mentioned something about it, but I would like to know if there is any thoughts from Emma or from Francis. And also, how can we approach that from a positive perspective? Because at the same time, we cannot constantly tell women that they are going to face issues of harassment, abuse, and intimidation, because that reinforces the idea that it is a very masculine and toxic environment. So how can we combine both, right? Like a positive message about politics and participating in politics, and at the same time making it clear that it might happen and how are we dealing with it.
Okay, we're gonna take a couple of questions and then we're gonna give it. So, column in the back.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Brilliant panel, found it really fascinating. I guess I have a question which is very related to Sophia's about how we balance structural reform with encouraging individual women. The example I have is related but a bit different. We know from selections, and Kiran will know from the Labour Party selections, that factionalism is very important to determining which candidate gets selected. So if you're encouraging an individual woman that you think would be brilliant to stand, do you tell them to approach the local faction and fix it? It would probably increase their chances of being selected, but it also reinforces the kind of internal political cultures in all parties that are very toxic and can lead to abuse of women and men. You know, there's nothing that gets people angry in internal politics and factionism. So I'm just wondering, related to Sophia's point, if you're an individual wanting to encourage an individual woman, do you encourage them to engage with existing party structures, informal as well as formal? Or do you take a more maximalist structural reform position at the potential cost of allowing more men to get selected in the short term? Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions before we give it to the panelists? You want to ask? Okay.
I never asked. Can I? Because I'm kind of curious about this. We all know Liz Truss possibly didn't make any good policy decisions, but did she come under more scrutiny because she was a woman? And does that put other women off becoming MPs because they see what happened to her?
Okay. So I think it's a lot of questions. I'll give you the floor.
Okay. I think this violence against women is a very serious issue. And I think it's a joint responsibility here if we want to build a better democracy. And this is why Ask Her to Stand is so important. The evidence is that women need to be asked at least 3 times. And 50-50 is a kind of friendly network. We have online meetings every week for each particular party. Tuesday is for Labour, Wednesday is for Lib Dems, Thursday is for the Conservatives. And it's great because parties are copying us. I mean, in particular, the Conservative Party. The Conservative Party have copied our Ask Her to Stand, which is fantastic. You know, imitation is the sincerest form of flattery. So that's really good. I think we have to basically offer and be supporting women doubly when they face this kind of antagonism. And in terms of political structures and informal networks, I think you have to be realistic. You have to support women and help them through the structures that exist. I would like to redesign democracy completely. I mean, I would probably like to redesign the voting system, but that just ain't going to happen quickly enough. The other thing I'd like to add is that there's safety in numbers. The Neil Parish incident, the guy watching pornography, right? You know, if that had happened like 10 years ago when there were only 23%, then women might not have felt confident enough to say something. But it was women in his own party that reported it, and several of them, you know. And so as the momentum, as we get more women involved, I mean, I think it was Hillary Clinton that said, if you want to get the sexism out of politics, you need to get more women into politics. And actually, you need to get more decent men into politics. So that's kind of where I think we have to go with this, is that there's safety in numbers. As we get more women involved, then the misogyny, they will feel safer reporting the misogyny or the sexism that they might experience, and hopefully, I don't really like that word, but that's the plan, with more decent people involved. There was something else I really wanted to amplify regarding Rainbow's points about parenting. Yeah, our system is based upon the idea that someone keeps the home fires burning, right? Mm-hmm. And it was always a woman that kept the home fires burning. And that's where parenting is so important. Parenting needs to be seen as a joint endeavour. So if a woman is putting herself forward into public life, and particularly into politics, then she needs a man or a co-parent, not necessarily a man, as you rightly point out, Emma. She needs a co-parent to be there to support her. So it is a joint endeavour. Politics requires teamwork. And in particular, it requires a supportive partner, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, I have 3 sons, so I can definitely attest to the fact that I would not be able to stand in the position if I am now and do the work I do without my wife. So clearly I wouldn't be here tonight. They're not at home fending for themselves, so absolutely.
It requires great teamwork, and it's about time really that men were prepared. And someone like Jess Phillips, she does say that. I'm sorry, there's one more thing I want to say about all-women shortlists, and I absolutely agree. The Labour Party made a difference because of all-women shortlists. But Conservative Party had an all-women shortlist in Canterbury. That's because all the best candidates were women. We need to understand that all-women shortlists might happen because all the best candidates might be women. We've had to put up with the argument that all the best people have been men. We've had all-male shortlists forever. Surely, statistically, one would expect now to get a lot of all-women shortlists because a lot of good women are coming forward, and talent lies with women too. Regarding the Liz Truss question, I might hand that on to other people.
Emma, want to go?
Do you want to use that? So I was going to address the comments. I think they were slightly similar on the violence and as well with especially the perhaps misogyny within the institutionalised misogyny perhaps. So I'd say first on that point, I think that the structure within the Conservative Party is slightly different to Labour's, and we're probably quite fortunate for the fact that we have slightly less member engagement, and our members are slightly older, and it is a different kind of community. It's not that they to be honest, are not as passionate about, and I don't mean to speak out of step because I'm not trying to misrepresent that passion, but I think the general consensus means basically it's quite, there's less engagement and you get less of that kind of pressure cooker kind of scenario, whereas especially around selections where we have quite a low-key selection where you'll make the application, it will go through a sift, and then you'll come to a meeting of members, and it's all done very low key, and privately. Whereas the Labour selections, they happen very much in public, with a lot of membership engagement. The unions are involved, and different factions as well get involved, and which is quite good in terms of the way that it creates creates more transparency around selection, creates more perhaps opportunity for people to get their voice heard and make more of an argument why they'd be a good candidate. But by the very nature of it being more public, I think there's more opportunity to face more scrutiny and more come into contact with more characters that may provide that kind of misogyny. So I think we're quite lucky. But so if I talk to our structures, it would depend very much on your local constituency branch, and we're very lucky in ours that it's always been women dominated. So perhaps I'm not the best person to talk to, because I'm sure it happens, and I'm sure when you have those dominated by old school kind of Shires Tories, I'm certain that they probably do face that, women that do face that, but I'd be probably unable to speak to that. I think certainly you do face the online hate and threats. I have quite a lot of death threats, and unfortunately you get them. You find yourself more targeted. I think perhaps as a Conservative, if you've been perhaps young, not that young anymore, but being slightly younger, being gay, perhaps there's certain people that think that you should think another way, and so you find yourself getting it from all sides. I stand up quite strongly for trans rights, but I'm still by somebody that was angry at the party's response to trans rights, sent me the most torrid, abusive death threats I've ever got, and I was thinking, hang on, I have to have death threats from people that are against me, let alone trying to be on the same side. So that can be quite stifling, and you do have to have a tough skin to get through that. And I think the issue as a woman that I find is that you have to have a tough skin within politics, right? But sometimes you look at your family and you look at your kids and they're going to school every day and you're thinking, if this affects them, then I can't live with myself for that. I can have a tough skin and I can think I don't mind what people say. I don't mind if someone attacks me. I'm happy to stand up for what I said. But you think, but it's your family that concerns you. And I think to come back to Francis' point, I've never been in favour of all women shortlists, because that intersectionality again. If you look at Parliament, we're very light on disabled representation, and there's a number of key, in terms of representation of ethnic minorities. There's so many areas in which Parliament is not representative that I think to have an entirely all women shortlist, I don't think is always helpful. But I do think it is always helpful to have women on the shortlist, which is something that we've aim for with the SIFs. So I think it's important to find that balance. All credit to Labour, and it has clearly done the job when you look at the parliamentary party now. But I would personally, I'd part ways slightly and advocate for a separate way, which would be that we should have women available for selection, but I think you have to bear in mind all those other kind of underrepresentations as well. And the fact that you don't want to put an all women shortlist in front of members and kind of ingrain that misogyny that, well, that woman's only there because she got put there. It's almost like you want a woman to go on the platform with a man and show, no, I'm the best because I'm the best. And I think that's what we've seen in the party. We're seeing more and more with Canterbury was a great show of that. And so we had, and Anna Firth, I remember, didn't get Canterbury, but she is now an MP in Southend, so it shows she's gone on to do great things as well.
Sorry.
Thank you.
Did you want me to say about Liz Truss? Because I feel like maybe no one else wants to. Sorry.
I'm happy to take it on, but I'm very happy to
No,
listen to
go
you.
on. Are you talking about? If you were going to talk
Rainbow,
about, I didn't want to look like I was hiding away from Liz. So.
I just want to start my remarks by saying I'm really sorry to hear about the death threats that you have received. It shouldn't be a part of public life. I mean, it is, and it is important. Francis has talked about that there is a network around you when that happens, and that's something very much, we are Labour women, but the network part is where we've seen actually lots of that positivity that you've mentioned on how you overcome this is by, yes, perhaps having a thick skin, but to be honest, things will get through that thick skin and it will hurt, and you need other people, and usually they are women, but not always, to be there to bring you back up and to remember why, what you're in politics for, and to help you when those times get tough. So I'm really sorry to hear your experience there. The comments that I'll make, I think the point that you mentioning about the levels of violence and harassment women in public life face, but also within parties, and the question about did Liz Truss face greater scrutiny because she was a woman, speak to the fact that these two are linked by misogyny, right? And that the world that I see, unfortunately, isn't misogyny free, and I think lots of women, hopefully you won't have had these experiences in life, but lots of people probably can speak to moments in time where they feel that they would have been treated differently, not had opportunities, had comments made in front of them, felt perhaps a bit unsafe, because the public sphere was designed for and by men, and the legacy of that is still felt. And political parties aren't immune from what takes place in society. So yes, there will be cases within all political parties of women having to deal with quite intolerable situations of harassment or violence. And the Labour Women's Network have made sure that there is a culture of supporting others to know how to report, so that there is action and people are the problem is they're known. For a lot of women in politics, what's really hard is making that report, because you're calling out somebody who will potentially affect your political ambitions. So whilst you can have the structures in place, while you can have the mechanisms and processes, you've got to understand the reality of the game as well. And it is a difficult place to navigate, but it doesn't mean that you abdicate your responsibility from doing that. So yes, you call it out. Yes, you make sure that And I think Parliament has done some good things in having the parliamentary staff network to ensure that abuse and harassment of parliamentary staff is also dealt with by neutral officials, I suppose, so it isn't tied to your own political fortunes and ambitions. So yes, perhaps Liz Truss did face greater scrutiny because she was a female leader, but she also drove the economy off a cliff. So I think anybody who does that should face public scrutiny. On Colin's point about overcoming factions within parties, I think the reality is that's what political parties are. And Emma talked about the differences between Labour and Conservative, how we select. I mean, we are a democratic organisation. We devolve our power to our members, and members will have a say on policy, on selections, and the movement. And so we've got the history of the trade unions as well. I mean, I think that is a positive way to enrich democracy, so that your political parties are also democratic. That does mean that members have a say and that factions arise. I suppose how we would... So what do Labour Women's Network do in that situation? Well, we are a sisterhood for all shades of red. We make sure that we are politically inclusive, and we educate and empower and equip women to take on the reality that they find it, so that they're there to change it. It doesn't mean you have to tolerate it, but you have to know what you're dealing with, because knowledge is power, and then power is power, and then power is change. So I think that's the philosophy of the Labour Women's Network, and I think on all women's shortlists, that's what brings you culture change. You needed the mechanism, because now we have got in our latest elections process, 42% of parliamentary candidates for the Labour Party are women, and they've been selected on open shortlists. I don't think we would have had that number had we not had all women shortlists, so that we could utilise the fact that women can be members of Parliament. So some people argue it's a bit chicken and egg, but I'm just very clear that without all women shortlists, the numbers wouldn't have gone up, and those talented women, who were talented, by the way, when they didn't get selected, can now go into selections a lot more confident that they will get selected from open shortlists.
Thank you. Okay, I'll start briefly with the response to the Liz Truss question. I don't think she got kicked out of office because she was a woman. I think she got kicked out of office because she was doing a bad job. But I think that her predecessor didn't get kicked out of office sooner because of the many different privileges that he possessed. Male privilege, white privilege, class privilege. So I think it's less about whether she should have been allowed to get away with more, and more about why certain other individuals aren't held to account quicker. I think is the answer.
Because can I say, I thought Theresa May also got more stick than her male counterparts.
Yeah, I think we saw that with the EU bill, where she came under so much flack for a bill that was, she was sort of, she tried, and then Boris Johnson came along with an almost identical bill, but ever so slightly worse, and everyone said, "Hooray! He's our saviour! He got Brexit done." So again, it's that double standard. I'll say a few things, if I may, about all women shortlists, placing it in a broader context. I'm an expert on gender quotas worldwide. And the evidence that we have is that gender quotas help to foster wider diversity from an intersectional lens. That when you get more women into Parliament, you also get more diversity of representation on many different dimensions, including ethnicity, including LGBT status, including class status, although slightly less on that last point because of my previously mentioned point about how expensive it is to run for office. That's partly because it helps to tackle what I call the meritocracy myth. This notion, when I recognise the arguments that if you have an all-women shortlist and there's that question mark over the women's merit, did they really deserve to be there, or did they only get there because it was an all-women shortlist? And what always amazes me with that is the amazing lack of embarrassment that men have when they're on a de facto, if not official, all-male shortlist. They got there were they really the best people to do the job? I think I look at a lot of the people in Parliament at the moment, I look at the men and I think, are you really the best people to do the job? I even have a standing joke now with my partner. Every time we see an MP do something awful, and sadly it's fairly regular, we just look at each other and say, but they were there because they were the best person for the job. Meritocracy has prevailed. And often what you see when you introduce gender quotas is an actual increase in merit, because what you're doing is you're getting rid of more of the people who shouldn't have been there in the first place and replacing them with people who had to fight harder to get in. And you're expanding the talent pool and increasing the competition. So it's less about doubting the qualifications and credentials of the people that are now finally having barriers into Parliament reduced, and more about calling out the people who got to jump over all those barriers in the first place and saying, were you really the best person for the job? Actually, no, maybe you weren't. And to the extent that they were, then they've got to fight to maintain their place in a wider talent pool. I'll say a little thing about the issue of calling out violence. One problem when there's violence or sexual violence or misogyny within a political party is that political parties are by nature tribal. And so if you make an accusation against someone within your party, you're not just embarrassing them, you are embarrassing the party. And so I've had a lot of people tell me that they were discouraged from doing it, not to protect the individual, but to protect the brand. And so there's that internal barrier that parties try and cover it up, they try and hush it up. And so we need parties to be more willing to acknowledge problems that go on within them. And last but not least, when I interview people about who looked after their children if they're members of Parliament, the men got women to look after their children and were often quite relaxed about that. They were kind of presumptuous about their female partner's willingness to look after their children. And the women got women to look after their children. Fortunately, in your case, you have a wife. In a lot of people's cases, they got their mum to look after their kids. The absence of male implication in childcare was quite striking. And Jess Phillips is the exception, and she's been quite open about her husband's role in childcare. But in many cases, it was if I can't do it myself, I will get another woman to do it on my behalf. And I think that's a culture that we really need to change.
So it isn't childcare, it's parenting. So if you're asking your partner to look after their child, it's not their parenting, they're not childcare, in my view. Just the put that out. Yeah.
Okay, I mean, I would love to ask, I have several questions to ask, but one, men should not monopolize any discussions, and second, we have an amazing guest to give the closing remarks. So I leave you to our newly appointed research fellow at the Institute.
Would you like my seat so you can face forwards?
That would be fine, thank you.
No, I'll do it because you're up on the end.
You sure?
Yeah, that's what I was trying to think
I
about.
think I'd also like a microphone.
There you go. I think this one looks better.
Thank you. Is this microphone all right?
Yes.
Okay, good. Sorry, I've spent a lifetime in politics and my voice is pretty shot through and not very good these days. Well, it's been fantastic, and thank you all of you for making those contributions. And what's been very good about this is it's actually been a cross-party event. I mean, we're used to talking about these things within our own parameters, but to have both main political parties here has been really good. And it's always a good idea to find out what other people do and how other ways of going about things. One of the main things that struck me, I'm a lot older than most members of the panel. I started in politics in the 1980s. And I'll tell you, it's a joy to hear people here, all four of you, discussing things now, because it's such an improvement on what it was 30 odd years ago. That it was at the time when Harriet Harman, who was an MP then, said that there were more men in the House of Commons called John than there were women. I mean, that's actually how bad it was. I mean, it was, and I actually went to a couple of parliamentary selections during that time, and it was a complete nightmare. And, you know, we have come a long way, and I think we should recognise that. And a lot of that is due to people like members of the panel who've actually worked on it and made sure that that we have the opportunities, women have the opportunities, and parties have the opportunities to have that talent now. I'd like to just go through some of the topics that have been raised, and I'll start with the obvious one, which we were beginning to pick up on the end, that political parties, they're not just tribal, they're political parties, and they have values and they have things that they want, and they're by their nature different from each other, and so they should be, and they fight for things that they believe in. So while we've had tremendous consensus and agreement and a very good discussion here, that always has to be remembered, and political parties by their nature will do things differently. It's made much worse in Britain by the kind of real adversarial political system that we have here, which just wasn't the case in the European Parliament at all, where there was much more consensus. And I think it was a lot better in a lot of ways. But that's where we are with it. So I think each party has to work it out for themselves. And in a lot of the internal stuff, there just won't be any crossover. And I think All Women Shortlists was a very good example of that, where it's made a tremendous difference in the Labour Party, as we've discussed. And obviously the Conservative Party does it rather differently, but with the same aims. And that's good. I mean, we need more women in Parliament. And I used to often get asked this, well, don't you just want Labour women? Of course I want Labour women, but we want women because of all the issues that we've raised about needing women's talent being there, wanting to raise issues like parenting, which seem to be much more of a women's issue now, though it's not, and all those other things that we've talked about. We do need women representatives, and that means that all political parties need to get on with that, but in their own way. And particularly, I think some of the things that and also the whole question about democracy. I mean, I don't see how you can have a real democracy and a real representative parliament if you don't have half of the population properly represented. I think it's a very fundamental question of democracy. We talked about things which particularly affect women, like maternity services and what we've just been talking about, childcare and parenting, so that women can actually stand for Parliament. And this hasn't really been resolved at all. In the European Parliament, we actually did have a crash. But part of the problem is, and I don't have an easy answer to this, people have to come to Parliament as an institution to vote and to take part in Parliament and its operation of Parliament. And while you have that, you're going to have a real problem about looking after children and parenting, unless you live in London, essentially. And I don't think anyone's really cracked that one, but I think I think a supportive co-parent is very, very important, and maybe that's another campaign. I mean, I think Jess Phillips has been really good talking about that, but I think we need to talk about that more and actually get men to understand that they're parents as well. And again, experience from the European Parliament. In Sweden and other Nordic countries, there are over 50% of women in their national parliaments from all their various parties. And one of the ways that's done, other than the Nordics are very much better at this than we are, is that there is much more recognition of co-parenting. In Sweden, fathers get paternity leave, and it's much more accepted. There's proper childcare, so it's not just women looking after the children. There's nurseries, and there's places where it's totally accepted that sort of thing takes place. So I think we do need to look at those institutions and also to the national culture as well. To go on to women themselves, yes, confidence. Confidence is a huge thing. I mean, actually, standing for Parliament will just do you in. I mean, it really does do you in, and you need tremendous confidence and stamina to do it. And I think that's got a lot better. I mean, we wouldn't have the number of women in Parliament that we have now if women weren't gaining confidence, but there's a long way to go still. And one of the things I've really noticed, being slightly older, is that there are a lot of younger women in Parliament now, and you see women dressed in bright clothes with long hair, and you think, this is fantastic. This is beginning to look like the the society which Parliament is supposed to represent. So we're getting there, but there's still a way to go, and women still need that confidence. It's still largely middle class women, with the honourable exception of Angela Rayner, who become MPs, and we need to sort of get over that, and we need to make it more representative in other ways as well. And we of course need to reform Parliament. I mean, the House of Commons is the most dreadful place in the world, I think. I think you're in year 7 was absolutely right. I mean, shouting at each other like this is just not acceptable. No other Parliament in the world behaves like that, not even the ones based on the Westminster model. We've really just got to start getting seriousness into debate in the House of Commons and get away from this public school yarboo, which, as somebody said, it's been set up on male structures, and that's a reflection of the male structures that existed at the time. And on the question of Liz Truss, I will put my 2 pennies in on this, because I think it's quite all right. She crushed the economy. She was the worst Prime Minister in British history. Unfortunately, she also happened to be a woman. So she has, I think, got... And Theresa May, I think, is a better example, who I agree with you, did actually get a lot of stick, undeservedly, I think, because I think she was trying her best. One of the things I used to find in the 1980s when we talked about getting more women into Parliament and women in leadership positions was, well, what about Margaret Thatcher? This was from Labour Party people. Margaret Thatcher's been terrible. She's been the worst Prime Minister we've ever had, and she's a woman. I mean, the answer obviously is yes, she was a woman. But she was a Conservative woman, and for people in the Labour Party that wasn't acceptable anyway. But there is a difficulty here about the political structures and way people in different parties of different political persuasions see leaders and women leaders. But I think I think women do have a much harder time in politics anyway. That's, I think, getting better because there are more women, and I completely agree with the idea that there are safety in numbers, and the more women you get, the more it's normalised, the less that will go on. The cost of selections was interesting. I mean, it's a big thing. It's something the Labour Party has looked at. We had Emily's List some years ago, and there's I think Labour Women's Network are doing something on this, but this is something else which needs to be looked at. Either funding from parties nationally or at local level, because you will deter women, particularly women who have childcare and parent, or feel they have childcare and parenting commitments, if they can't actually feel that they can afford to do it. So the whole cost of it really needs to be, I think, dealt with much better and much more thoroughly than it has been. That was those, and also to end on the whole question of violence and harassment. Me and my colleagues in the European Parliament female colleagues quite often used to talk about this. And it's very interesting there was not one of us, none of us out of that group said that we had never experienced any sort of sexual harassment in the party and at work. This was not a very representative sample, but it was interesting that is absolutely endemic, or at least it was. And the Labour Party is finally beginning to wake up to the fact that this happens. And there is more evidence to show that that kind of casual sexism, which somebody mentioned, Laura Bates, actually can lead to things which are potentially a lot more serious, like violence against women, like abuse, like death threats. And Jo Cox, I mean, which is just awful. And it's surprising the number of female politicians who have received death threats. I mean, it's a frightening number. And, and unless we get this sorted out, unless there are some sort of sanctions taken and more effort put into stopping this sort of abuse, women will be put off, because who is going to want to go into a job where you, at the very least, get abuse, at the very worst, far more than that. So there's a lot of cultural things that still need changing. I do think it's so much better than it was 30 years ago, but we've got a lot of work to do still. And I hope that in my lifetime, or even before the end of my lifetime, we will see an equal 50-50 Parliament. That's our goal. And until that, we will not have full democratic representation in Parliament.
get the microphone back. Okay, so I think my only remaining job here is on behalf of the Malin Institute and School of Politics and International Relations at Queen Mary to give a big thanks to all of amazing guests. Thank you very much for the conversation. Thank you very much for your enthusiasm, but also for tackling different issues. I hope you will agree with me that there is a lot to do, but also it seems that things are not as bad as they were a few years ago. But yeah, hopefully we can get to that point. Thank you very much everyone for coming.